Hello, everyone. I'm Happy Caldwell, and welcome to Arkansas Alive. All this week, I'm going to continue on investing for the future. But today, we're going to start with deliverance from generational poverty. Stay tuned. You know, I don't guess anybody really knows and understands how important it is that we know that poverty is a curse. It's not a blessing. And there's nowhere in the Bible where it supports the fact and statements that other people have made about God wanting us poor or God keeping us poor. In fact, the Bible says just the opposite. The Bible says that He gives us power to get wealth. Why? The purpose of prosperity. The purpose for investing in the future. So God can establish His covenant with men. That's Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 17 and 18. I want to talk to you about biblical economics, investing for the future, because if Jesus tarries His rapture of the church, catching the church away, if He tarries, then we're all going to have to face the future. And you can tell by watching the evening news, the future does not look too bright from a secular worldview. But from a biblical worldview, you have nothing to fear if you know the Word, if you know what the Bible says. And that's what I'm here for. Okay, let's go to Proverbs chapter 6. And let me read to you verses 9, 10, and 11. And I hope you get your Bible and follow along with me. Proverbs 6, 9, 10, 11. How long will you sleep, O sluggard? When will you arise out of your sleep? Yet a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep, so shall your poverty come as one that traveleth, and thy want as an armed man. Now, if I can paraphrase this, he's not talking about not sleeping or not napping or not resting. He's saying if you're given to sleep, if you're given to inertia, if you're given to no movement, if you're given to no motivation, if you're lazy, if you're living with an entitlement mentality, he says your poverty is going to come upon you like a man that traveleth, or a man that's walking or moving, like a man that's moving toward you, and your want as an armed man. An armed man comes up and says, give me your wallet, give me your purse. He wants something. He's going to take something from you. And he says that's the way poverty is going to come. It's going to come to take something away from you if you're not alert, if you're not industrious, if you're not motivated, if you're not doing something, if you're not releasing your faith, if you're not sowing, if you're not investing in the future. He said poverty is going to come take you over. Now, let me define poverty for you, because there are many of us that have had to deal with this. I had to deal with it early on after becoming a Christian, after getting born again. I had to learn, my goodness, all these years I've had the mindset of poverty. I've had a poverty mentality. And I know where I got it. I got it from my family. I got it from my father and his father. And we're going to talk about that. You might want to listen for yourself. Poverty mindset is cyclical. It's generational. It's passed from one generation to the next. I'll never have anything. Your daddy never had anything. Your grandfather never had anything. You'll never have anything. He never amounted to anything. She'll never amount to anything. That's cyclical poverty. It's passed on from one generation to another. It's actually taught. It's learned behavior. Now, my dad, unknowingly, he didn't know what he was doing, because he was raised during the Depression. And his father taught him, and he taught me about poverty. He didn't know he was doing it. I didn't know he was doing it. I loved my grandparents, and I had 2 sets growing up, and I loved them. I spent a lot of time with them. I appreciated so much learning their generation, my father's generation, and carrying me into my generation. And I would go over to my grandfather's garage. Now, this was when you could own your own cow and your own chickens in the backyard. And he lived over off Thayer Street, which was off Asher Avenue. And, you know, when the law changed, his homestead was grandfathered in, as they said. And his barn was a place of fascination for me. I mean, he had chickens in the roost, and he had a cow in the backyard, and she had a bell around her neck. And grandmother had named all the chickens. She could call them by name, and she'd get the egg. I loved to go gather the eggs. And my grandfather was quite a handyman, a workman. He built his own house. He built his own furniture. And I would go out there. I loved to go to his workbench. And he had a grindstone that you'd crank to sharpen your tools. He sharpened his axe and his saws. He sharpened his own saws. And I noticed that he had these little jars along his workbench. And I would ask him, you know, I'm just a boy. I'm probably, school age, 6, 7, 8, 9 years old. And I would go over there and I would ask him what was in those jars. One of those jars, and just take a little side trip here. I have one of those jars, those cans, a coffee can, that he had on his workbench today. He gave it to me. He gave me all of his tools. They're all hand tools. There's no power tools. There's a big giant auger that you drill holes with, and there's crosscut saws and straight saws and hacksaws and hatchets. And he gave me all of that stuff because he saw that I enjoyed woodworking and enjoyed that stuff. But he had all these little jars, and in one jar, it was full of sawdust. Sawdust. And I said, Grandfather, what's that jar for? That's sawdust. He said, yep. He said, I take the sawdust that I cut when I cut a board or something. He said, I sweep up and save the sawdust and put it in that jar. I'm thinking to myself, why in the world would anybody save sawdust? Why don't you just sweep it out the door on the ground? He said, oh, no. He said, you never know when you're going to need some sawdust. I mean, my grandfather kept everything because that's what the Depression did with people. They didn't throw anything away. I mean, you used everything and you kept everything, and you never knew where the next meal or the next this or that was coming from. So you didn't throw anything away. You kept it all. You could use it later. And that transgressed or was transposed from him to my father to me. And I said, well, what do you use the sawdust for? He said, well, and when he would make furniture, let's take, for example, he made a coffee table. He made some chairs with dowels. He would take the sawdust and mix it with glue, wood glue, and make a paste. And he would use it to glue this furniture away. The sawdust gave it strength. It was wood. So that's what he saved the sawdust for. He had one whole side of his barn, his garage. He had one whole side of it covered in license plates from every car that he'd ever owned. Now, my grandfather was born in 1889, and he lived to be 90 years old. My grandmother was born in 1913, and she lived to be 93. They raised 4 children. The oldest child, my uncle, lived to 103. So they had long life in the family. We have a long life in our family. And I loved to hear about their generation. So I would ask him questions, and I would watch him and see how he did things. And I would pick up how he thought. And my father was raised under that same umbrella of poverty. They didn't know it was poverty because that's just the way it was as they were growing up. As you know, they lived through the Great Depression. Daddy went and fought in World War II. He came home, greatest generation, they rebuilt America. But in this period of adjustment, I began to see that there was something different about the way they thought in the way some of my friends or some of their friends thought. Everybody didn't think the way they thought because everybody didn't have a spirit of poverty. And my daddy said this to me. He said, son, you have champagne tastes with a beer pocketbook. Now, to me as a boy growing up, that didn't mean a whole lot. I didn't know anything about either of those things. I mean, I didn't know what champagne was. I knew what beer was because that's what my daddy drank. But he was telling me, he said, son, you have expensive tastes. And if I did, I didn't know it. You have expensive tastes, but you don't have the money to back it up. And that went in me. And from the time that he said that to me, I always thought that way. I thought least, less, do without. I always thought you have desires, you have tastes, you want or would like to have nice things or whatever, but I never could afford it. And it always came back to me, my dad's words to me. You have champagne taste and a beer pocketbook, which means you don't have the money to afford what you want. Now, my daddy did teach us to save, and we did that a little. My sister did it more than me. She did it better than I, but I didn't develop a mindset of saving. I developed a mindset of wanting to acquire or possess something just simply so I could afford something. Well, I grew up that way. We always bought the cheapest. We always looked for the least expensive. Now, my dad, when he came home from World War II, he told me this. He worked 2 jobs. He worked one job at night at Pfeiffer's Department Store down on Main Street, and he worked another job during the daytime at U.S. Time Corporation. They made Timex watches. It's located out of the airport. And my dad said he would never buy anything at Pfeiffer's Department Store. Now, some of you, if you're younger, you don't know what I'm talking about. It was a big department store. Gus Blass and Pfeiffer's Department Store were 2 of the largest stores in Little Rock, and they were, several stories high, kind of like on a smaller scale of Macy's in New York. I mean, it was and you had elevators that you'd go, and they had an elevator operator, and you'd get on, and he'd say, what floor, please, and he'd take you up there. These were the post-World War II days, and the country was booming because we'd won the war, we were victorious, and we were rebuilding, and there was spiritual revival in the 50s, and Billy Graham was preaching everywhere, and people were prospering. And they'd sacrificed for 4 years, from 41 to 45, during the war. They did without tires and gasoline and rationing and automobiles and refrigerators. We had an ice box, and they were seeing, oh man, what is this thing? We'd go down to the Western Auto store and watch this little box that had pictures in it through the window. It was called a television in 1953, and we saw this television. Nobody had a television that we knew, and so we'd go down there and stand in front of the window and watch the television box. I mean, these were pioneering days, beginning days of this new post-war prosperity. Well, my dad made $19 a week, and he never would buy anything at Pfeiffer's. And I said, why? Later on, I said, why don't you shop there? He said, because I worked there. Now, this is not a criticism. Everybody does this. He said, I worked there, and he said they would take items, clothing items, from the main floor, and they would take them down to the basement. I mean, when you go to the basement, you're getting a bargain. That's where that phrase, bargain basement, came from. They would take the priced items off the first floor, and they'd take them down to the basement. And he said they would mark them up and then mark them down. And the customers thought they were getting a discount, but really they weren't getting a discount at all. The item had been marked up, and then marked down. It looked like you got a discount, but you really weren't. And they took them from the first floor, say, to the bargain basement, and that's where they sold the, quote, lower-priced goods. And he said that's why he would never shop there, because they were dishonest and they were not, But everybody does that now. My wife and I were in a store the other day in Park Plaza Mall, and of course that Park Plaza Mall is in foreclosure, I guess due to the pandemic, and so many stores went bankrupt and they folded and they're gone and they're closing down. Now Dillard's is still there, but the bulk of the Plaza Mall is empty. I mean, it's really sad. And we were walking. She had to make some exchanges at Dillard's, so we were walking through the mall, and I saw this store I'd never seen before. So we went in there. I've never seen such low prices. I mean, you're almost tempted to buy something because it's so cheap. You don't need it. You don't want it. If you look at the quality of it, it's real inferior workmanship. But, you can buy winter coats for $10. I mean, you can buy stuff for $13. I mean, this is unheard of. That's what's called a loss leader. My minor in college was marketing. A loss leader is what they print in the paper or put on the internet or a pop-up ad. It's what they do to get you in the store. It's a loss leader. It's something in the grocery store that's dirt cheap, half price of what it normally is. And it's designed to get you in the store and then expose you to all kinds of other items that are much higher priced. Now, this is just marketing techniques. This is common. Well, you grow up in that mindset. I also saw when my mother would take me downtown Little Rock, and she would park the car and tell me to stay in the car. She had to go into the store, and she'd come back. And you would always park at the same corner, and I would watch this man that was sitting, I don't know what you would call it. He was sitting, looked like he was sitting on the ground, on the sidewalk, but he was sitting on a pillow. And he had a tin cup and a stick, and he looked like he was blind. And people would come by and drop money in that cup. And one day, I sat there long enough, and I watched this big, fancy new car pull up right to the curbside where he was. And they opened the door, and he got up off that pillow, put his dark glasses in his pocket, put the money he got in the cup in his pocket, got up and got in that car and drove off. He wasn't blind. He was conning people. He was just begging people, and they would give him money. We see the same thing today. When you see all of the signs out there, guys holding up, "We'll work for food," go try to get them to go to work. Go up and say, "Hey, I'll pay you if you'll come cut my grass," and see how many of them will go with you. They really don't want to work. They just know they want you to make a donation. So you grow up with these things in your mind, and you're thinking, wow, nothing is what it appears to be. And you grow up with this poverty mindset. And today, the government is the biggest funding agent of poverty that there is in the country. The government actually funds poverty. The government does not want you to teach prosperity to people. They don't want people to prosper. They want people to stay poor, because then the government can raise money or budget money from the federal budget to help the poor. But what they're doing is they're funding a poverty mindset. They want you to stay poor. They don't want you to prosper, because if you start prospering and they have no funding to give to poverty or an entitlement, they lose their allotment for the next year. I knew I was getting a lot of junk mail. This was a few years ago. So I went down to my local post office in the neighborhood that I lived in. And I carried all this junk mail up, and I sat it on the desk, and I asked the guy behind the counter, I said, I don't want this junk mail anymore. I said, would you send it all back to sender, mark return to sender, and send it back to him? He said, oh, no. He said, we're not going to do that. I said, why not? He said, well, you'll have to pay the postage. He said, the government's not going to pay the postage on that. He said, look, the post office thrives off of junk mail. I said, what do you mean? He said, we don't want those people to stop sending you stuff. We live off of junk mail. Junk mail is prosperous to the post office. Well, the shape the post office is in today, the U.S. Post Office, it ain't thriving too much because they've been broke for years, bankrupt. But, because the government is one of the poorest managers of anything. And I said, you mean you're not going to send this? They said, no, sir. We love junk mail. It clogs up the post office boxes. It takes their time, their energy, and it's virtually worthless to the receiver. It's all solicitation. And he said, we live off of junk mail because they pay us. So even the post office is not interested in eliminating entitlement mindset because they're making money off of it. Now, I say all these things to give you an understanding that poverty is much more than just not having money. Poverty is a mindset. It's the way you think. It's the way we've been trained. It's the way we live today. And I want to get you out of it. I want to get you delivered from generational poverty. If you want to be, you got to want to be. Now, there's no more get-rich-quick schemes. There's no more castles in the sky. There's no more diamonds in the rough. There's no more free meals. Well, I take that back. There are free meals, but somebody's paying for them. I used to work for a company one time. Out in the warehouse, he had a big sign. It said, there are no more free meals. Everybody works. Now, they were doing it to stir up their workforce. In other words, you don't get something for nothing. But in reality, you do. If somebody's paying for it, you say, oh, well, the government's paying for it. Well, no, you're paying for it. If the government's paying for it, you're paying for it. All the money that the government gives to fund abortions, Planned Parenthood, you give them your tax dollars. All the money that the United States government is sending to the terrorist organizations in the Middle East, Iran, funding Al-Qaeda, funding all these terrorist organizations, it's your tax dollars. President Obama loaded up pallets, billions of dollars, in a United States military aircraft and flew it to Iran and gave it to them. Did he ask you? No. Did he ask anybody? No. He just did it. So the government is the worst manager, worst business person on the earth. And yet they're using your tax dollars to fund all of their foolish programs. And that keeps people angry. That keeps people not trusting the government. And, poverty's big business. Every time you see these racial riots, all this stuff, you'll always see 2 or 3 organizations with leaders that go in there. And because riots, especially race riots, are very profitable because these organizations that attach and identify themselves with this, that's where they make their money. That's how they raise funds. We get so much money by being on the site and on the scene and being involved in all of these activities. So let me define poverty for you in this beginning. Poverty is a deficiency, a lack. It's a need. But it also means to occupy. Remember Proverbs 6? He said poverty will come as a wanted man, as a traveleth man, as a man that's armed. It means to occupy. You occupy by driving out or seizing and possessing what does not belong to you. You remember over in Proverbs where it says, if you catch the enemy, you make him pay 7 times. And I've heard that quoted lots of times, referring to whatever the devil's stolen from you, you can get it back 7 times more. And people have used it that way, but that's not what it is referring to. If you go back over there and read it, you'll see that it's talking about adultery. And he says the adulterer, he's talking about adultery. He says if a man steal to satisfy his soul, that's one thing. But if he commits adultery, he is stealing something that doesn't belong to him. That husband or that wife doesn't belong to him. And so that's a poverty mindset. Theft, a thief is always dealing with a poverty mindset. They don't have anything. They don't want to work. They don't want to do anything. They're going to steal it or take it from somebody else. And it doesn't have to be breaking into your house, stealing your TV set. It can be in the top floor of the office building. You're stealing stuff through financial how would I say it? You're deceiving people. Deception. You're getting them to believe something that's not true. So poverty is when you experience deficiency, you have need. It's somebody coming and stealing from you, driving out and seizing and possessing what doesn't belong to them. Now, we've just laid the foundation here for investing in the future. We've talked about generational poverty. Let me define for you generational poverty, and then we'll pick this up again tomorrow. Generational poverty is defined as having been in poverty for at least 2 generations. Now, I explained that to you in the beginning statements today. My grandfather, my father. Generational poverty was taught and modeled, not on purpose, but out of ignorance. And that's where it comes from. We'll start here tomorrow. Please join me, and remember, Jesus is Lord of Arkansas, and wherever you're watching, too.
Send your questions, comments, and testimonies to Happy Caldwell at Post Office Box 26207, Little Rock, Arkansas 72221, or email happycaldwell@vtntv.com. Remember to follow VTN on Facebook at VTN Your Arkansas Christian Connection, and follow Happy Caldwell on Twitter at Happy_Caldwell. VTN is on Roku. Search VTN in the channel store and add us to your lineup. Today's episode is available to watch on demand at VTNTV.com and click Watch. You can also watch VTN via live stream at VTNTV.com.